When my husband called me useless in front of his business partners after I lost my corporate job, he had no idea that the rejection letter in my purse wasn't from another failed interview. It was actually confirmation that my secret startup had just been acquired for $97 million, and I'd been planning my exit strategy for months. Let us know in the comments where you're watching. If this resonated, don't miss out on subscribing because tomorrow I'm sharing something that will completely change how you think about this topic. I still remember the exact moment my seemingly perfect life began to crumble. It was a gray Thursday morning in November in the bustling financial district of Riverton City. The kind of morning where the autumn fog rolled off Lake Meridian and wrapped around the glass towers like a suffocating blanket. I had just been escorted out of Pinnacle Financial Group with a cardboard box containing 6 years of my professional life, a ceramic mug from the company retreat, a small succulent that had somehow survived under fluorescent lights, and a framed photo of my wedding day. The layoffs had been swift and brutal. 43 employees eliminated in a single morning, casualties of what the CEO cheerfully called strategic right-sizing for optimal market positioning. I was employee number 17 on the list, my position as senior investment analyst deemed redundant after the merger with their East Coast competitor. As I stood on the sidewalk outside the imposing steel and glass building where I'd spent the better part of my 20s, clutching my cardboard box of displaced memories, I felt the familiar weight of my phone buzzing in my purse. My husband, Garrett. How did it go? His voice carried that practiced concern I'd grown accustomed to over our 5 years of marriage. They eliminated my position, I said simply, watching the stream of fortunate employees still inside, visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows, their careers intact and their futures secure. The pause that followed lasted just a beat too long. Oh, well, Natasha, maybe this is actually a blessing in disguise. You've been so stressed lately, maybe you can take some time to figure out what you really want to do. What I really wanted to do. As if my career in finance had been some kind of hobby I'd stumbled into rather than the result of my MBA from Westbrook University and years of climbing the corporate ladder in a male-dominated industry. I'm a financial analyst, Garrett. I'm good at what I do. I just need to find the right opportunity. He looked up from his phone then, and I saw something in his expression that I'd never noticed before. A kind of patronizing patience, like he was humoring a child who insisted they could fly. Of course, babe. Whatever you think is best. The next 3 weeks dissolved into a blur of networking events, informational interviews, and carefully crafted cover letters. The Riverton financial sector was tight-knit, and news of Pinnacle's layoffs had spread quickly. Every conversation seemed to carry the subtext that I was damaged goods, tainted by association with a company that made strategic mistakes. Garrett's initial supportiveness gradually morphed into something less encouraging. When I'd been unemployed for 2 weeks, he started making subtle comments about our expenses. When it stretched to 3 weeks, the comments became less subtle. Maybe you should consider expanding your search beyond finance, he suggested one evening as I prepared for yet another networking mixer. There are opportunities in other fields, administrative work, maybe customer service, something to bring in income while you figure out your next move. Administrative work, customer service, as if my MBA and 6 years of experience analyzing complex investment portfolios qualified me for nothing more than answering phones.
The breaking point came on a rainy Tuesday evening in December. Garrett's company was hosting their annual client appreciation dinner at the Sterling Club, an exclusive establishment where Riverton's business elite gathered to see and be seen. I'd attended similar events throughout our marriage, always as the supportive spouse, making conversation about market trends and economic forecasts with Garrett's colleagues and their clients. This year felt different. I was no longer Natasha, the investment analyst. I was Natasha, the unemployed wife. The distinction seemed to follow me through every conversation like a shadow. "Natasha," called Rebecca Ashford, the wife of Meridian Tech's biggest client. "How are you, darling? Garrett mentioned you're between positions right now. Any exciting prospects?" The phrase "between positions" stung like a euphemism for failure. "I'm exploring several opportunities," I replied with practiced diplomacy. "The market is certainly competitive." "Oh, I'm sure something will come along," she said with the breezy confidence of someone who had never faced employment uncertainty. "Maybe something part-time, something that gives you more flexibility." More flexibility for what, I wondered? More time to perfect my role as Garrett's accessory wife? As the evening progressed, I found myself gravitating toward the bar, nursing a glass of wine and observing the social dynamics I'd never paid attention to when I'd had my own professional identity to maintain. The wives clustered together, discussing charity galas and interior designers, while the men dominated conversations about business strategy and market opportunities. I was standing alone, watching the rain streak the windows overlooking the harbor, when I overheard Garrett's voice carrying from the adjacent conversation circle. He was talking to Marcus Wellington, the CEO of Meridian Tech, and several other executives I recognized from previous events. "The thing about Natasha," Garrett was saying, his voice carrying the slight slur that meant he'd had one too many scotches, "is that she's always been a bit unrealistic about her career expectations. She thinks because she had a decent position at Pinnacle, she's entitled to walk into something equivalent somewhere else." My hand tightened around my wine glass as I realized he was discussing me as if I were a problematic child rather than his partner. "The truth is," he continued, and I could hear the forced camaraderie in his voice, the way men bond over shared frustrations with their wives, "is that she's probably better suited to something more domestic. Less pressure, more time for the things women are naturally good at." "Well," Marcus chuckled, "maybe unemployment will teach her some humility. Sometimes life has a way of putting people where they belong." And then came the words that would echo in my mind for months afterwards, delivered in Garrett's voice with casual cruelty that took my breath away. "Honestly, guys, it's probably for the best. Between you and me, Natasha was never as competent as she thought she was. Maybe now she'll realize that some people are just useless in the professional world." Useless. The word hit me like a physical blow. I set my wineglass down on the nearest table with trembling hands, afraid I might drop it. Useless. My husband of 5 years, the man who slept beside me every night, who had benefited from my income and professional connections, who had claimed to love and support me, had just dismissed my entire career as evidence of incompetence? The conversation continued around me, but I heard nothing else. The sound of rain against the window seemed to grow louder, drowning out the ambient chatter of the party. I excused myself to the restroom, needing a moment to process what I'd just heard. Standing in the marble-appointed ladies' lounge of the Sterling Club, staring at my reflection in the ornate mirror, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. The hurt was there, sharp and immediate, but beneath it was something else, something harder and more determined. Useless. I opened my purse to touch up my lipstick and maintain my composure for the remainder of the evening when my fingers brushed against the envelope I'd been carrying for 3 days. The envelope I hadn't mentioned to Garrett because the timing had seemed wrong, because I'd been waiting for the right moment to share my news. The letter from Avalon Ventures, the venture capital firm based in Silicon Valley. The letter confirming their acquisition offer for TechFlow Solutions, the financial technology startup I'd been developing in secret for the past 8 months, the startup that had just been valued at $97 million. I looked at my reflection again, seeing not the unemployed wife who had been dismissed as useless, but the entrepreneur who had been quietly building something remarkable while everyone around her assumed she was failing. Garrett had no idea what was coming. None of them did. That night, after Garrett's devastating words at the Sterling Club, I lay awake staring at the ceiling in our bedroom while he slept peacefully beside me, completely unaware that his useless wife had just received a $97 million acquisition offer. But the real story began
8 months earlier when a chance encounter at a coffee shop changed everything I thought I knew about my own capabilities.
It was a mundane Tuesday morning in March when I first met Dr. Raymond Castellanos at Brew Point Coffee, the small independent shop 3 blocks from Pinnacle Financial. I'd been grabbing my usual oat milk latte before work when I noticed an older gentleman struggling with his laptop at a corner table, muttering in frustration at what appeared to be a frozen screen. "Excuse me," I found myself saying, approaching his table. "I couldn't help but notice you're having computer trouble. Mind if I take a look?" Dr. Castellanos looked up with weary eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "I'm afraid I'm rather hopeless with technology. I'm trying to access my research data, but this contraption seems determined to thwart me." Within 5 minutes, I diagnosed the problem, a simple software conflict, and had his system running smoothly again. As I prepared to leave, he insisted on buying my coffee and introduced himself properly. "I'm Raymond Castellanos, Professor Emeritus of Computer Science at Westbrook University, and you, my dear, have just saved me from what would have been a very unproductive morning." We fell into conversation, and I found myself explaining my work in financial analysis, my frustration with outdated systems at Pinnacle, and my observations about inefficiencies in the industry's technology infrastructure. Professor Castellanos listened with an intensity that surprised me. "You know," he said finally, leaning forward with sudden interest, "what you're describing sounds remarkably similar to a project I've been developing. A blockchain-based platform for institutional financial transactions. The problem is, I understand the technology, but I'm useless when it comes to the business applications." That word, useless, would take on such bitter irony months later. Over the following weeks, our coffee meetings became regular occurrences. Professor Castellanos would arrive with prototypes and technical specifications, while I brought market analysis and real-world applications from my experience at Pinnacle. What started as casual conversation evolved into something much more significant. "Natasha, I have a proposition for you. I've been watching how you think about problems, how you bridge the gap between theoretical possibility and practical implementation. I believe we could build something revolutionary together." Inside the folder were preliminary designs for TechFlow Solutions, a comprehensive platform that would streamline institutional financial transactions using advanced encryption and machine learning algorithms. The technology could reduce processing times from days to minutes while maintaining security standards that exceeded current industry requirements. The university has provided seed funding for research, but what we need is someone who understands how to take this from laboratory to marketplace, someone who knows what financial institutions actually need, not what academics think they need. I stared at the documents, my mind racing through possibilities I'd never considered. "You're talking about starting a company." "I'm talking about revolutionizing an industry," he corrected with a slight smile. "The question is, are you interested in being part of something that could change everything?" That evening, I sat in our loft apartment with the TechFlow materials spread across our dining room table, waiting for Garrett to come home from his weekly poker game with his college friends. When he finally arrived, slightly drunk and cheerful, I attempted to share my excitement about Professor Castellanos' proposal. "A startup?" Garrett laughed, loosening his tie as he headed toward the kitchen. "Babe, 90% of startups fail in the first year. Besides, you have a great job at Pinnacle. Why would you risk that for some professor's pet project?" "It's not just a pet project," I insisted, following him into the kitchen. "The technology is genuinely groundbreaking. If we can develop this properly, it could transform how institutional trading happens." Garrett opened a beer and leaned against the counter, studying me with an expression I now recognize as condescending tolerance. "Natasha, you're brilliant at analyzing other people's investments, but starting a company? That's a completely different skill set. It requires vision, leadership, risk tolerance.
He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air. Those weren't qualities he associated with me. Maybe you should focus on doing well at Pinnacle instead of getting distracted by side projects. If you really want to advance your career, put that energy into climbing the corporate ladder. I closed the Tech Flow folder without another word, but Perfecta Pastoralosa continued to occupy my thoughts. Over the next several days, I found myself researching everything I could about startup development, technology, commercialization, and the venture capital process. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that TechFlow represented exactly the kind of innovation the financial industry desperately needed. When I met Professor Castellanos the following Tuesday, I came prepared with a comprehensive business plan outline, competitive analysis, and preliminary financial projections. "Impressive," he said, reviewing my work with obvious approval. "You've identified market opportunities I hadn't even considered. Natasha, I believe you have genuine entrepreneurial instincts." "I've been thinking about your offer," I said carefully. "If we're going to do this, we need to do it properly. Incorporated entity, clear equity structure, professional development timeline. And I'd want to maintain my position at Pinnacle while we develop the initial prototype." "Agreed completely. I never expected you to abandon your security for an unproven venture, but I do think we should move quickly. The window for this kind of innovation won't remain open indefinitely."
That weekend, while Garrett attended a client golf tournament, I drove to Professor Castellanos' home office in the University District. His converted garage had been transformed into a sophisticated technology laboratory, complete with multiple workstations, server equipment, and prototype devices I couldn't begin to identify. "Welcome to TechFlow headquarters," he said with evident pride. Modest, perhaps, but functional, and completely private. We spent the entire day working through technical specifications, discussing implementation challenges, and refining our business model. By evening, we had established the framework for what would become a revolutionary financial technology platform. "There's something else we need to discuss," Professor Castellanos said as we concluded our session. "Funding. University seed money will cover initial development, but scaling to commercial viability will require significant investment." "How significant?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Conservative estimate? $2 to $3 million for full development and market launch." The number was staggering, far beyond anything I could personally finance. But as I drove home through the quiet streets of Riverton, I found myself thinking not about the obstacles, but about the possibilities. For the first time in my professional life, I was excited about work in a way that transcended mere job satisfaction. Over the following months, I developed a carefully structured double life. During business hours, I maintained my role as senior investment analyst at Pinnacle, performing my duties with the same competence that had earned me consistent positive reviews. But every evening and weekend, I transformed into Natasha the entrepreneur, working with Professor Castellanos to develop TechFlow from concept to reality. The secrecy was necessary for multiple reasons. Pinnacle Financial had strict policies regarding outside business interests that could represent conflicts of interest. More importantly, I needed to prove to myself that I could build something significant before sharing it with Garrett or anyone else in my personal life. We established TechFlow Solutions as a Delaware C Corporation, with Professor Castellanos as Chief Technology Officer and myself as Chief Executive Officer. The equity split was 60-40 in my favor, reflecting my larger role in business development and eventual day-to-day operations. By June, we had completed our first working prototype, a simplified version of the platform that successfully processed simulated institutional transactions with 94% efficiency improvements over existing systems. The results were extraordinary, validating our core assumptions about market need and technological feasibility. "Natasha," Professor Castellanos said after reviewing our latest performance metrics, "we're ready for the next phase. It's time to start talking to investors." The venture capital process proved both exhilarating and exhausting. We presented to 12 different firms over a 3-month period, refining our pitch with each presentation.
Most were politely skeptical about our ability to compete with established financial technology companies. Several questioned whether a university professor and a corporate analyst possessed the leadership experience necessary to scale a technology startup. But 3 firms expressed serious interest, leading to due diligence processes that consumed every spare moment of my time. I became expert at scheduling investor calls during my lunch breaks, attending technical demonstrations on weekends, and reviewing legal documents late at night while Garrett watched television, unaware that his wife was negotiating million-dollar investment deals. The breakthrough came in September when Avalon Ventures, a Silicon Valley firm specializing in financial technology investments, offered to lead a Series A funding round. Their terms were aggressive but fair. $15 million investment for 35% equity, with the requirement that we relocate operations to California within 6 months of closing. This changes everything, Professor Castellanos said when we received the term sheet. We're no longer talking about a small technology project. This is a legitimate company with serious growth potential. I knew he was right, but I also knew that accepting Avalon's offer would require decisions I wasn't prepared to make. Relocating to California would mean leaving Pinnacle, leaving Riverton, potentially leaving Garrett if he wasn't willing to relocate for my career. While I wrestled with these implications, Avalon Ventures conducted their final due diligence review. Their technical team validated our platform's performance claims. Their business analysts confirmed our market opportunity assessments. Most importantly, their financial projections suggested that TechFlow could achieve profitability within 18 months and potential acquisition or IPO opportunities within 3 to 5 years. Then came the phone call that changed everything. It was a Thursday afternoon in early November when Jennifer Park, the managing partner at Avalon, called with unexpected news. "Natasha, we've received an unsolicited acquisition inquiry from Meridian Systems," she said, her voice barely containing excitement. "They're interested in purchasing TechFlow outright rather than waiting for us to scale through traditional venture funding." Meridian Systems was one of the largest financial technology companies in the world, with institutional clients that included every major bank and investment firm. Their interest validated everything Professor Castellanos and I had built. "What kind of numbers are we talking about?" I asked, barely breathing. "Their initial offer is $97 million for full acquisition. That would represent approximately $58 million for your stake, Natasha. Before taxes, obviously, but still. $58 million from unemployed to multimillionaire in matter of months. Built through work I'd done in secret while my husband dismissed my professional capabilities? I need to discuss this with Professor Castellanos," I managed to say. "Of course, but Natasha, this offer won't remain open indefinitely. They want a response within 2 weeks." I hung up the phone and sat in my car in Pinnacle's parking garage, staring at the concrete walls and trying to process what had just happened. 8 months earlier, I'd been a frustrated analyst dreaming of more meaningful work. Now I was facing a decision that would make me financially independent beyond my wildest imagination. That evening, I met Professor Castellanos at our usual coffee shop to discuss Meridian's offer. His reaction was immediate and decisive. "We accept," he said without hesitation. "Natasha, this represents validation beyond anything we dared hope for. Meridian doesn't acquire companies unless they see extraordinary potential." "It feels surreal," I admitted. 8 months ago, I was just complaining about inefficient systems at work. Now we're talking about selling a company for nearly $100 million? "Not we," he corrected gently. "You. This was your vision, your leadership, your business development that made this possible. I provided technical expertise, but you built TechFlow into something acquisition-worthy." Professor Castellanos was being modest, but I appreciated his recognition of my contribution. For months, I had been developing confidence in abilities I never knew I possessed. Strategic thinking, leadership, entrepreneurial risk-taking, capabilities that Garrett had dismissed as beyond my reach. Over the following week, I worked with Avalon Ventures and our legal team to structure the acquisition agreement. Meridian's due diligence process was intensive but successful. Their technical review confirmed our platform's capabilities. Their business analysis validated our market assumptions. Most importantly, their cultural assessment concluded that TechFlow's innovation approach aligned perfectly with Meridian's strategic objectives. The final acquisition documents arrived on the same day I was laid off from Pinnacle Financial. While I sat in my car outside the building with my cardboard box of displaced belongings, my phone contained email confirmation that I had become a multi-millionaire. The irony was almost too perfect. On the worst professional day of my conventional career, I had achieved the greatest entrepreneurial success of my life. But I told no one. Not my colleagues at Pinnacle, not my friends, not even my mother, and especially not Garrett, who continued to offer condescending advice about finding appropriate employment while remaining completely oblivious to his wife's transformation from corporate analyst to tech entrepreneur. I wanted to see how he would react to my apparent failure before revealing my actual success. I wanted to understand who he really was when he thought I needed his support versus his judgment. The answer, delivered in his cruel words at the Sterling Club, exceeded my worst expectations, but it also clarified exactly what I needed to do next. Useless, he had called me. The woman who had just sold a company for $97 million. Now it was time to show him precisely how wrong he had been. The morning after the Sterling Club humiliation, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. Garrett was already in the shower, humming tunelessly as he prepared for another day at Meridian Tech, completely unaware that his useless wife was about to become one of the wealthiest self-made women in Riverton City. But before I could savor that moment of vindication, I needed to execute my plan with the same precision that had built TechFlow Solutions. I called Jennifer Park at Avalon Ventures before 7 a.m. Pacific time, catching her just as she arrived at her Palo Alto office. Natasha, perfect timing. Meridian's legal team just sent over the final acquisition documents. Everything looks clean. We could close as early as next Friday if you're ready to proceed. I'm ready, I said, watching Garrett through our bedroom window as he loaded his BMW for another day of marketing presentations. But I need the closing to happen in a very specific way. Jennifer paused, and I could hear the slight confusion in her voice. What kind of specific way? Personal reasons. Let's just say there are people in my life who need to understand that they've underestimated me, and timing will be crucial for maximum impact. Jennifer Park laughed, a sound that contained both amusement and admiration. I have worked with a lot of entrepreneurs, Natasha, but I've never had someone choreograph their exit quite this precisely. I'm intrigued. Consider it done. With Avalon Ventures aligned on my timeline, I moved to the next phase of my preparation. I contacted Marcus Wellington's assistant at Meridian Tech and requested a brief meeting to discuss potential consulting opportunities for unemployed financial analysts. The irony of asking Garrett's CEO for career advice while secretly preparing to become wealthier than anyone in his company was almost too delicious to resist. Mrs. Blackstone, Marcus's assistant replied when I called. Mr. Wellington has a brief opening Thursday afternoon at 3 p.m. He mentioned he'd be happy to provide guidance given your situation. My situation. If only they knew.
Tuesday and Wednesday passed in a carefully orchestrated performance of continued job searching. I attended 2 networking events, submitted applications to positions I had no intention of accepting, and maintained the facade of increasingly desperate unemployment. Garrett's behavior during this period confirmed every suspicion I'd developed about his true character. "How did the interviews go today?" he asked Tuesday evening, barely looking up from his laptop as I entered our apartment. "I didn't have any interviews," I replied, hanging my coat in the entryway closet. "I was working on applications and reaching out to contacts." "Ah," he returned his attention to his screen. "Well, maybe tomorrow." Although, honestly, Nat, you might want to consider lowering your expectations a bit. The market is tough right now, and you can't afford to be too picky. Lowering my expectations. The woman who had built a company worth nearly $100 million should lower her expectations. Wednesday brought more of the same patronizing advice, delivered with increasing frequency as Garrett seemed to grow more comfortable with his role as the successful spouse, offering wisdom to his struggling wife. "I was talking to Rebecca Ashford today," he announced over dinner at Riverside Tavern, the modest restaurant we'd begun frequenting to save money during my unemployment. "Her husband mentioned they're looking for someone part-time in their accounting department. It's not glamorous, but it would be income while you figure out your next move." Part-time accounting work. Bookkeeping for a construction company. This was what Garrett considered an appropriate career trajectory for his wife with an MBA and 6 years of experience in institutional finance. "I'll think about it," I replied, cutting my salmon with more force than necessary. "Good, because honestly, Nat, I'm starting to worry about your mindset. You seem to think you can just waltz back into a senior analyst position like nothing happened. But being laid off, it sends a signal to other employers. It raises questions about your performance." The casual cruelty of his assessment stunned me into momentary silence. According to Garrett, being eliminated in a corporate restructuring somehow reflected personal ineptitude rather than economic circumstance. "What kind of signal do you think it sends?" I asked carefully. "That maybe you weren't as essential as you thought you were," he replied with the confidence of someone who had never faced professional uncertainty. "Look, I'm not trying to be harsh, but someone needs to give you a reality check. The sooner you accept that you might need to start over in a less demanding role, the sooner you can begin rebuilding." Starting over. Rebuilding. These concepts felt surreal coming from someone who was about to discover that his wife had secretly built and sold a technology company while he was offering unsolicited career advice. Thursday afternoon, I sat in Marcus Wellington's impressive corner office overlooking Meridian Tech's campus, accepting his offer of coffee while internally calculating that by tomorrow evening, my net worth would exceed his annual salary by a factor of 10. "Natasha, I appreciate you coming in," Marcus began, settling behind his mahogany desk with the comfortable authority of someone accustomed to dispensing wisdom. "Garrett mentioned you're going through a challenging transition right now." "The job market has been difficult," I agreed, playing my role perfectly. "I'm exploring various options and hoping to find the right fit." "Well, I've been in business for over 20 years, and I can tell you that setbacks like this often turn out to be opportunities in disguise. Sometimes we get comfortable in positions that aren't really challenging us to grow." The irony was breathtaking. Here was Marcus Wellington, CEO of a mid-sized technology company, explaining to the founder of a $97 million startup that unemployment might help me develop greater ambition. "What kind of opportunities should I be considering?" I asked, genuinely curious about his assessment of my potential. "Honestly, you should think about roles that play to your natural strengths. Financial analysis is important work, but it's also quite technical and detail-oriented. Not everyone thrives in that environment long-term." "What environment do you think I'd thrive in?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying me with the expression of someone solving a moderately interesting puzzle. "Well, you're articulate, personable, good with people. Have you considered sales? Or perhaps marketing? Something more relationship-focused, less numbers-heavy." Sales. Marketing. According to the CEO of Garrett's company, the woman who had built advanced financial technology should consider abandoning analytical work entirely in favor of relationship-focused roles that presumably required less intellectual rigor. "That's an interesting perspective," I replied neutrally. "I hadn't considered moving away from finance entirely."
Sometimes we limit ourselves by thinking too narrowly about our capabilities. You have to be realistic about market demand. There are hundreds of financial analysts looking for work right now, but companies always need good salespeople. I nodded thoughtfully, as if this revelation about my limited potential was genuinely helpful rather than laughably wrong. I'll definitely think about exploring those options. Excellent. And Natasha, don't be discouraged by the setback. Some of the most successful people I know had to completely reinvent themselves after career difficulties. This could be the beginning of something better.
As I left Marcus's office, I reflected on the consistent theme emerging from these conversations. Every man in my life, my husband, his CEO, even casual acquaintances at networking events, seemed convinced that my unemployment represented evidence of overreaching rather than misfortune. They all assumed I needed to lower my expectations, accept lesser roles, and fundamentally reconsider my professional capabilities. None of them could conceive that the quiet woman they'd dismissed might have been building something extraordinary while they offered condescending advice about accepting my limitations. That evening, I made my final preparations for Friday's revelation. I compiled a list of media contacts, including the business reporters from Riverton Herald, Meridian Business Journal, and the regional correspondent for Financial Times. I prepared individual emails that would send automatically at 4:30 p.m., each containing the press release about TechFlow's acquisition, along with personalized notes highlighting the local angle of the story. I also crafted carefully worded messages for key people in my life, my mother, my former colleagues at Pinnacle, and several friends who had offered support during my apparent unemployment. These messages would go out simultaneously with the press release, ensuring that news of my success spread quickly through multiple networks. Most importantly, I planned exactly how I would tell Garrett, not through email or text message, but in person, with the acquisition documents spread across our dining room table, the wire transfer confirmation displayed on my laptop screen, and the evening news playing in the background as reporters discussed Riverton's newest multimillionaire entrepreneur. Friday morning arrived with unseasonable warmth for December in Riverton City. I woke early and spent an hour in our home office reviewing the final acquisition documents that Avalon Ventures had sent the previous evening. Everything was perfect. Clean terms, clear documentation, and a closing timeline that would conclude with wire transfer confirmation by 3:45 p.m. Eastern. Garrett left for work at his usual time, kissing me goodbye with perfunctory affection, while reminding me that Rebecca Ashford was expecting my call about the part-time accounting position. "Don't wait too long to reach out," he advised, adjusting his tie in the hallway mirror. "Opportunities like that don't stay available forever." "I'll call her this morning," knowing that by evening, part-time bookkeeping would seem like advice from another universe. At 11 a.m., I received final confirmation from Jennifer Park that all systems were go for the 3:30 p.m. closing. At 1 p.m., I heard from our legal team that Meridian Systems had completed their final wire transfer authorizations. At 2:45 p.m., I positioned myself in our home office with multiple screens open: email, banking, news feeds, and social media. At exactly 3:43 p.m., my phone chimed with a text from Jennifer Park. "Wire transfer confirmed. Congratulations, Natasha. You're officially a multimillionaire." I stared at my banking app as the numbers updated in real time. After taxes and legal fees, my net proceeds from the TechFlow acquisition totaled $52.3 million. More money than I had ever imagined possessing, earned through work I had completed while everyone around me assumed I was failing. At 4:30 p.m. exactly, the coordinated media releases went live. Within minutes, my phone began buzzing with calls from reporters, former colleagues, and friends who had just learned that Riverton's unemployed financial analyst had secretly built and sold a technology company for nearly $100 million. I ignored the calls and focused on my final preparation. I printed copies of the acquisition documents, the wire transfer confirmations, and several of the news articles that were already appearing online.
I arranged these materials carefully on our dining room table, creating a display that would tell the complete story at a single glance. Then I sat down to wait for Garrett to come home, savoring the last few hours before he discovered that his useless wife had just become one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the city's history. The woman he had dismissed and underestimated was about to teach him exactly how wrong he had been. Garrett arrived home at 6:15 p.m., 30 minutes later than usual, whistling as he entered our apartment with the casual confidence of a man who believed he held all the power in our relationship. I heard him drop his keys in the ceramic bowl by the entrance, the same routine he'd followed for 5 years, completely unaware that this evening would shatter every assumption he had made about his wife's capabilities. "Nat," he called out, his voice carrying that familiar tone of mild concern mixed with patronizing patience. "How was your day? Did you manage to call Rebecca about that part-time accounting position?" I was seated at our dining room table, the acquisition documents arranged in perfect order before me, my laptop open to display the wire transfer confirmation showing $52.3 million deposited into my personal account just 3 hours earlier. The evening news played softly on our television, where Channel 7's business reporter was preparing to deliver the lead story about Riverton's latest tech entrepreneur success. "I'm in the dining room," I replied calmly, my hands folded over the paperwork that would change everything. "We need to talk."
Garrett appeared in the doorway, loosening his tie with one hand while scrolling through his phone with the other, probably checking scores or social media. He glanced at me briefly, then did a double take as he registered the formal presentation of documents spread across our table. "What's all this?" he asked, pocketing his phone and approaching with curiosity rather than concern. "Did you finally organize all your job application materials? Good idea. Presentation matters when you're networking." Even now, faced with obvious evidence that something significant was happening, his first assumption was that I was finally taking his advice about improving my job search strategy. "Sit down, Garrett," I said, gesturing to the chair across from me. "There's something important I need to share with you." He settled into his seat, his expression shifting to the practiced patience he'd perfected over the past month, the look of a successful husband prepared to offer encouragement to his struggling wife. "Before we begin," I continued, reaching for the television remote, "I want you to watch something." I increased the volume just as Channel 7's business segment began. The anchor, Catherine Morrison, appeared on screen with her professional smile and authoritative delivery. "Good evening, I'm Catherine Morrison with a remarkable local business story. Riverton entrepreneur Natasha Blackstone has sold her financial technology startup, Tech Flow Solutions, to global industry leader Meridian Systems for $97 million. The acquisition, which closed this afternoon, represents one of the largest tech deals in our region's history." Garrett's head snapped toward the television, his expression transforming from patient attention to complete confusion. What did she just say? The startup, which specializes in blockchain-based institutional trading platforms, was developed over the past 8 months in partnership with Westbrook University professor Raymond Castellanos, Catherine continued. According to Avalon Ventures, the Silicon Valley firm that facilitated the deal, TechFlow's proprietary technology can reduce financial transaction processing times by up to 94% while maintaining enhanced security protocols. "Natasha Blackstone," Garrett repeated slowly, his eyes moving between the television screen and my face. That's your name." Ms. Blackstone, 29, was previously employed as a senior investment analyst at Pinnacle Financial Group before launching TechFlow Solutions earlier this year. The acquisition makes her one of the youngest self-made multimillionaires in Riverton's history, with industry analysts estimating her personal stake in the deal at approximately $52 million. I muted the television and watched Garrett process what he'd just heard. His face cycled through disbelief, confusion, and the beginning of something that might have been panic. "I don't understand," he said, finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is some kind of mistake. You've been unemployed for a month. You've been struggling to find work." "No, Garrett," I replied, sliding the first document across the table toward him.
He picked up the acquisition agreement with trembling hands, his eyes scanning the legal text as if it might transform into something comprehensible through force of will. I watched him locate his own name in the document, listed as my spouse for tax purposes, and saw the moment when the reality began to penetrate his shock. This says you've sold a company for," he couldn't finish the sentence. $97 million, I completed for him. TechFlow Solutions, the financial technology startup I built while you assumed I was failing at everything. But when? How? I never saw you working on anything like this. I leaned back in my chair, savoring this moment I'd imagined for weeks, the moment I knew I'd have one day, even if I didn't know exactly how it would happen. Every evening when you thought I was job hunting, every weekend when you went to golf tournaments or poker games, every morning when I left early for networking coffee meetings, I was building TechFlow. Garrett set down the acquisition agreement and stared at me as if I'd revealed myself to be an entirely different person, which, in many ways, I had. "This is impossible," he said, shaking his head. "You're a financial analyst. You don't know anything about starting companies or developing technology." "Apparently I do," I replied, sliding my laptop toward him so that he could see the banking app displaying my current account balance. As of 3:43 p.m. today, I personally own $52.3 million in liquid assets. He stared at the screen for a full 30 seconds, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid. I recognized the signs of someone whose entire worldview was collapsing in real time. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, finally, his voice carrying a note of betrayal that I found almost amusing given the circumstances. "We're married. We're supposed to share things like this." "Share," I repeated, allowing ice to enter my voice for the first time. "The way you shared your real opinions about my professional capabilities with your colleagues at the Sterling Club?" Garrett's face went pale. "You heard that?" "Every word." I reached for another document from my carefully arranged display. "Including your assessment that I was useless in the professional world, that some people are just naturally suited for more domestic roles." "Natasha, I was drunk. I didn't mean—" "I meant every word. Just like you meant it when you suggested I should consider part-time accounting work, or that Marcus Wellington recommended I explore sales positions because analytical work might be too challenging for someone like me." "You talked to Marcus?" Garrett's voice cracked slightly.
Yesterday afternoon. He was very generous with his career advice for the unemployed wife of one of his employees. Suggested I think about roles that played to my natural strengths, apparently meaning anything that didn't require serious intellectual capability. I stood and walked to our living room window, looking out at the harbor lights while Garrett struggled to process the magnitude of his miscalculation. "Do you want to know what's really interesting about today?" I continued without turning around. While Marcus was explaining that I should lower my expectations and consider sales work, I was 12 hours away from becoming wealthier than he'll ever be. While you were suggesting part-time bookkeeping, I was finalizing the largest technology acquisition in Riverton's history. "Natasha, please," Garrett said, and I heard his chair scrape against the floor as he stood. "I know I said some things that were insensitive, but you have to understand the pressure I've been under. Your unemployment was affecting both of us financially." I turned to face him, studying this man I'd shared a bed with for 5 years, wondering how I'd ever found his combination of arrogance and mediocrity attractive. "My unemployment affected us financially?" I repeated. "Garrett, I just earned more money in 8 months than you'll make in your entire career. Every dollar you worried about losing during my month of unemployment represents about 6 minutes of my current net worth." The math was brutal, but accurate. Garrett's annual salary at Meridian Tech was $127,000, respectable but unremarkable. My acquisition proceeds exceeded 40 years of his current earnings. "This changes everything," he said, and I saw something calculating enter his expression. The shock was giving way to adaptation, the recognition that his wife's success represented opportunity rather than threat. "We can pay off the mortgage, upgrade to a better neighborhood, maybe get that lake house we talked about." "We?" I asked softly.
Well, yes, we're married. This is amazing news for both of us. I returned to my seat at the dining room table and opened another folder, removing documents I'd prepared earlier that afternoon while waiting for the acquisition to close. That brings us to the next part of our conversation, I said, placing a business card on the table between us. I've retained Patricia Hendricks as my divorce attorney. She specializes in high net worth asset protection. Garrett stared at the business card as if it might explode. Divorce? Natasha, you can't be serious. We can work through this. So I said some stupid things when I was drinking. This isn't about what you said, I interrupted, though that wasn't entirely true. This is about what you revealed, about who you really are when you think I need your support versus your judgment. I've always supported you. You supported the version of me that needed your approval, I corrected. The moment you thought I was vulnerable, you couldn't wait to diminish my capabilities and redirect my ambitions toward roles you considered more appropriate for someone like me. My phone buzzed with an incoming call from a number I didn't recognize. Probably another reporter seeking comment on the TechFlow story. I declined the call and noticed 17 missed calls and 43 unread text messages from friends, colleagues, and media contacts who had just learned about my success. Everyone I know is finding out about TechFlow right now. Former colleagues, friends, family members. They're all discovering that the woman you called useless just sold a company for $97 million. Garrett's face flushed deep red. Natasha, please. We can fix this. I'll apologize publicly if that's what you want. I'll tell everyone how wrong I was. It's too late for apologies, I replied, standing and beginning to gather the documents from the table. The acquisition closed 3 hours ago. The press release went out at 4:30 p.m. By tomorrow morning, everyone in Riverton will know that your unemployed wife was secretly building a multi-million-dollar company while you advised her to accept part-time bookkeeping work. I paused in my document gathering to meet his eyes directly. There's one more thing you should know, I continued. Meridian Systems has offered me a position as Chief Innovation Officer at their headquarters in San Francisco. The role comes with a $500,000 base salary, plus equity participation in future acquisitions. You're moving to California? I'm moving to California, I confirmed. Patricia will be in touch early next week to begin asset division discussions. Given that TechFlow was developed entirely before and during our marriage, using my independent intellectual property, I expect the settlement to be quite favorable to me. Garrett sank back into his chair, the reality of his situation finally penetrating completely. His useless wife was not only leaving him, she was leaving him as one of the wealthiest self-made women on the West Coast. This is insane, he said, his voice hollow. 3 hours ago, I thought you were unemployed and struggling. Now you're telling me you're a multi-millionaire tech entrepreneur who's divorcing me and moving across the country? That's exactly what I'm telling you, I replied, closing my laptop and preparing to leave him alone with the wreckage of his assumptions. As I headed toward our bedroom to begin packing, I paused in the doorway for one final observation.
You know what the most satisfying part of today has been, Garrett? It wasn't the $52 million, though that was nice. It wasn't seeing my name on the evening news, though that felt wonderful. It was sitting in Marcus Wellington's office yesterday afternoon while he explained that I should consider sales work because analytical thinking might be too challenging for me. I smiled, remembering the conversation that now seemed to have occurred in an alternate universe. Because in 12 hours, I'll be worth more than his entire company, and you'll still be his marketing director, wondering how you managed to lose the most successful entrepreneur you'll ever know. 6 months later, I stood in my corner office on the 47th floor of Meridian Systems San Francisco headquarters, looking out at the Golden Gate Bridge while reviewing quarterly innovation reports that would have seemed like science fiction during my days at Pinnacle Financial. The morning fog was just beginning to lift from the bay, revealing a city that had embraced my vision in ways Riverton never could. My official title was Chief Innovation Officer, but the role had evolved into something far more significant.
Meridian CEO David Chen had given me unprecedented autonomy to identify and develop emerging financial technologies with a budget that exceeded the entire annual revenue of Garrett's former company. In 6 months, I had overseen 3 additional acquisitions, totaling $340 million, and launched 2 proprietary platforms that were already generating 8-figure returns. The transformation hadn't been immediate or simple. Those first weeks in San Francisco had been a whirlwind of relocation logistics, legal proceedings, and media attention that took considerable adjustment. The divorce settlement with Garrett had been concluded with ruthless efficiency. Patricia Hendricks had negotiated terms that left him with exactly what he'd contributed to our marriage, which was remarkably little once TechFlow's intellectual property was properly valued. Garrett had attempted several desperate maneuvers during the settlement process. He'd hired an aggressive attorney who argued for substantial spousal support based on his sacrifices supporting my career development. The argument collapsed when Patricia presented evidence that Garrett had actively discouraged my entrepreneurial pursuits and had publicly dismissed my professional capabilities just hours before the acquisition closed. The final settlement granted him our Riverton apartment, his personal belongings, and a modest cash payment that covered his transition costs. Everything else, the TechFlow proceeds, my new salary, and all future earnings, remained solely mine. Her attorney had protested the disparity, but Patricia's documentation of his psychological and emotional undermining of my career created an airtight case for protecting my independent assets. Your husband spent months convincing you that you lack the capability for professional success, Patricia had explained during our final settlement conference. He actively discouraged your entrepreneurial development and publicly humiliated you for pursuing ambitious career goals. California courts don't reward that kind of behavior in asset division proceedings. The morning after our divorce was finalized, I received a text message from Garrett that I saved as a reminder of how thoroughly circumstances had changed. Natasha, I've been thinking about everything that happened. Maybe we moved too quickly with the divorce. I know I made mistakes, but I've learned from them. Would you consider reconciliation? I could relocate to San Francisco and we could start fresh. I shown the message to my assistant, Carmen Rodriguez, a brilliant Stanford MBA who managed my increasingly complex schedule with diplomatic precision. He wants to reconcile now that you're worth $52 million and earning $500,000 annually? Carmen had asked with barely concealed amazement. Apparently, my professional capabilities have become more attractive since the acquisition, I'd replied, deleting the message without response. That had been 4 months ago. Since then, Garrett had made increasingly desperate attempts to reestablish contact, including showing up unannounced at Meridian's headquarters during a business trip to San Francisco. Security had escorted him from the building after he'd spent 20 minutes in the lobby demanding to see his wife, apparently unaware that our divorce had been finalized weeks earlier. The incident had prompted David Chen to suggest I consider relocating to Meridian's New York office if continuing harassment became problematic. But I declined the offer, not because of Garrett, who had become irrelevant to my decision-making process, but because San Francisco represented exactly the kind of innovation ecosystem where my vision could flourish without limitations. My personal life had evolved with the same intentionality that characterized my professional development. I'd purchased a stunning penthouse in Pacific Heights with panoramic views of the bay, designing the space to reflect my aesthetic preferences without accommodation or compromise. The apartment featured a dedicated home office where I developed preliminary concepts for technologies that might not reach market for years, plus a formal dining room where I hosted dinners for entrepreneurs, investors, and technology leaders who valued my insights.
Most significantly, I'd begun mentoring young women entrepreneurs through the Bay Area Women's Innovation Council, sharing the strategic thinking and preparation techniques that had enabled my transition from corporate analyst to technology executive. These mentoring relationships provided perspective on my own journey while helping others avoid the psychological undermining I'd experienced. The key insight, I explained during a recent panel discussion at Stanford's Graduate School of Business, is recognizing that other people's limitations on your potential often reflect their own insecurities rather than your actual capabilities. My husband's assessment that I was useless in the professional world revealed his need to diminish my ambitions rather than any objective evaluation of my abilities. The Stanford presentation had been recorded and shared widely across social media, generating thousands of comments from women who identified with experiences of professional dismissal and personal undermining. Several major publications had requested interviews about my transition from unemployed wife to tech executive, framing my story as emblematic of broader patterns in how women's ambitions are systematically minimized. Forbes had featured me on their 30 under 30 list in the technology category with a profile that highlighted TechFlow's development timeline and my strategic approach to building companies while maintaining existing employment. Harvard Business Review had commissioned an article about stealth entrepreneurship, developing businesses in parallel with traditional careers, using my experience as the primary case study. But the most satisfying recognition had come from an unexpected source. Professor Raymond Castellanos had been invited to present our TechFlow development process at the International Conference on Financial Technology Innovation, where our collaboration was studied as a model for university-industry partnerships. During his presentation, he'd credited my business development leadership as the primary factor in transforming laboratory research into commercial success. Natasha Blackstone represents the future of technology entrepreneurship, he'd concluded in his remarks. She combined analytical rigor with strategic vision and execution capabilities that exceed anything I've observed in 30 years of academic research. TechFlow succeeded because she understood both the technical possibilities and the market realities necessary for commercial viability. The presentation had been attended by venture capitalists, technology executives, and academic researchers from around the world. Several had contacted me afterward with collaboration proposals for future projects that could dwarf TechFlow's impact and financial returns. 1 year after the TechFlow acquisition, Meridian Systems announced my promotion to Executive Vice President of Strategic Innovation, with expanded responsibilities for identifying and developing emerging technologies across multiple industry sectors. The role came with equity participation that could potentially exceed my TechFlow proceeds if our strategic initiatives achieved their projected returns. But financial success, while gratifying, had become secondary to the broader transformation in how I approached challenges and opportunities. The woman who had once tolerated Garrett's condescending career advice now made decisions affecting hundreds of millions of dollars in technology investments. The analyst who had been dismissed as useless now advised Fortune 500 companies on innovation strategies that shaped entire market sectors. Last month, I'd received an invitation to speak at the Riverton Chamber of Commerce's annual Business Leadership Conference. The organizers had specifically requested that I address entrepreneurial resilience and strategic career development, apparently unaware of the irony in asking me to return to the city where I'd been systematically underestimated. I'd accepted the invitation partly for the satisfaction of addressing many of the same business leaders who had witnessed Garrett's dismissal of my capabilities at the Sterling Club, but primarily because my story might inspire other women to recognize their own unrealized potential. The speech had been scheduled for next month, with advance publicity noting that Riverton's most successful technology entrepreneur would be returning to share insights about building companies and navigating career transitions. The local business journal had requested an interview during which they'd asked whether I planned to reconnect with former colleagues and friends. I'll be focused on the conference presentation, though I understand several former associates have expressed interest in catching up. Among those former associates was Marcus Wellington, whose company had struggled significantly since my departure from Riverton. Meridian Tech had lost 2 major clients and had been forced to lay off 15% of their workforce, including Garrett, whose position had been eliminated during strategic right-sizing for optimal market positioning, the same euphemism that had disguised my own layoff at Pinnacle Financial. The irony hadn't been lost on me when Carmen had forwarded the news article about Meridian Tech's difficulties. The company whose CEO had advised me to consider sales work because analytical thinking might be too challenging was now failing due to their inability to adapt to technological changes I could have helped them navigate. Garrett's subsequent career trajectory had been less successful than Marcus's. After losing his position at Meridian Tech, he'd struggled to find equivalent employment in Riverton's limited technology sector.
According to mutual acquaintances who occasionally provided updates, he'd eventually accepted a marketing coordinator role at a regional accounting firm, a position several levels below his previous responsibilities and roughly equivalent to the part-time bookkeeping work he'd suggested I consider during my apparent unemployment.
But I rarely thought about Garrett or the life I'd left behind in Riverton. My focus had shifted entirely to the future, the technologies I was developing, the companies I was building, the women I was mentoring, and the possibilities that emerged when intelligence and ambition operated without artificial limitations. Standing in my office that morning, reviewing reports about innovations that would reshape entire industries, I reflected on the journey from that devastating evening at the Sterling Club to this moment of unprecedented professional authority. The woman who had been called useless now controlled strategic decisions affecting billions of dollars in technology investments. My assistant knocked and entered with my morning schedule and a coffee prepared exactly as I preferred it. Another small luxury that reflected my transformation from accommodating others' preferences to asserting my own. Your 10 a.m. video conference with the Tokyo team is confirmed, Carmen reported. The London presentation has been moved to 2 p.m. Pacific to accommodate their schedule changes. And David Chen would like to discuss the quantum computing acquisition proposal when you have availability. Quantum computing. Technologies that existed at the intersection of physics and mathematics, requiring exactly the kind of analytical thinking that Marcus Wellington had considered too challenging for someone like me. Schedule 30 minutes with David after the London call, I replied, already considering the strategic implications of entering quantum technology markets. And Carmen, add a note that I'll want Professor Castellanos included in any technical due diligence for the quantum acquisition. As Carmen departed to coordinate my schedule, I returned my attention to the Golden Gate Bridge, now fully visible as the morning fog retreated toward the Pacific Ocean. In a few hours, I would be making decisions that could influence the direction of entire technology sectors, using capabilities that my former husband had dismissed as inadequate for part-time bookkeeping work. The transformation was complete, but the story was just beginning. Each day brought new opportunities to build, to innovate, and to demonstrate that the only limitations on human potential are those we accept from people too small to recognize what we're capable of achieving. Tomorrow, I would begin developing technologies that didn't yet exist, solving problems that hadn't yet been identified, and proving once again that the most dangerous thing anyone can do is underestimate a woman who has decided to stop underestimating herself. Next up, 2 more stories chosen just for you. If you enjoyed this, you'll want to see what's coming. Tap to keep going.